Welcome to the video, guys. Today we're going to be talking about some of the quirks and the hidden features found in Sony cameras. Now, some of these may apply to other brands apart from Sony, and some of them may not be found in all Sony cameras. And don't be expecting too much action from him in this video because it's rather warm in here today and I suspect he can't be bothered. So the first hidden feature, although it's not actually that hidden, is something called Aperture Drive in autofocus. This can be found on tab 1, page 8 on the Sony A7III menu, and on the A7 III it has two options, standard and silent. I do believe on some of the higher end cameras like the A9 series there is a third option, but the two options you get on the A7 III let you adjust how quiet the aperture mechanism on the lenses will be. And what it does is, in standard, when you're trying to focus, particularly in low light, the camera will open up the aperture to let more light through, and then when you take the picture, it will stop the aperture down. However, there is a slight audible noise every time the aperture opens and closes, and sometimes you're trying to be particularly quiet. So if you change the aperture drive setting to silent, the camera will keep the lens's aperture at whatever you've dictated it to be, so there will be no opening and closing of the aperture. Now, there is a potential drawback to this mode, which the camera does warn you about, which is that the autofocus speed may be slower in silent aperture drive mode. And that's because with the aperture unable to change and open and let more light through, the autofocus system in low light might struggle and hesitate that little bit more. So it becomes a balance between, do you need the aperture to be silent or not? And on the topic of autofocus, I'm going to address I'm going to use the term quirk very loosely here, but I've seen some people ask, particularly about the A7 III, about not having AF assist available in continuous shooting. When you're autofocusing in really low light and the camera is seriously struggling, there is a little assist lamp here that will help put some more light on your subject, and some flash guns have an AF assist built into them as well. However, these will only work in single shot autofocus. Understandable, really, because if you were in continuous autofocus, the camera would be continuously autofocusing, which means the AF assist lamps would need to be continuously on, and then they'd get in the way of your pictures. So for anyone who's had this quirk with AF assist lamps not working in certain modes, it only works when you're in single shot autofocus. And then lastly, on the topic of seeing in the dark, I want to thank Stuart James Photography for telling me about a feature called bright monitoring. Now, this is very, very niche. It only works in stills and it only works in manual focus, and it is so well hidden there isn't even an option in the menu for it. You have to access it through a custom button. So you'd have to go onto your menu, go to tab 2, page 8 for custom operations, select the custom button for stills, and then select whichever custom button you want to assign this feature to, and tab over to page 18 of 23, and you will find the option for bright monitoring. With that done, if you're in a stills mode and your camera's set to manual focus, and your screen is so dark that you just can't see where you're focusing, you can press the button you've got assigned to bright monitoring and you will notice your entire viewfinder suddenly gets a whole lot brighter. Now, I'm not entirely sure as to all the specifics that the camera does when you do this, but it seems to open your aperture up as bright as it can go, will probably boost your ISO as much as possible as well, and I think it also alters the refresh rate of the screen in order to try and get more light showing per frame. But basically, if you're in a very dark situation that you can't physically see where you're trying to focus, having bright monitoring enabled will suddenly make it a whole lot easier to see. Now, there are a couple of quirks to this. Obviously, the ones I've already mentioned, it only works in stills, you can't use it in video. It only works in manual focus, the camera can't autofocus with bright monitoring enabled. And lastly, and most disappointingly, is if you try and zoom in to your viewfinder to really pinpoint focus, bright monitoring will shut off. Next, we'll go to a weird quirk that I stumbled upon the other week, which is sometimes when I'm having... Sometimes when I'm trying to shoot very low to the ground with the tripod that I've got, I end up having to have the camera hanging below the tripod upside down. Now this can make operating the camera a little fiddly because all the controls are on its head, but thankfully because of the gyro sensors in the camera knows it's upside down. So when you then take a picture and go into playback mode, the image will appear the right way up relative to you so you can see. Until you zoom in. When you zoom in, the image reorientates itself relative to the camera so it now appears upside down to you. Don't know why. And speaking of shooting on a tripod, that brings us to the last hidden feature for this particular video, which is the countdown timer. Now, very often when I'm shooting on a tripod, I will have a slight delay on the camera, depending on how I've got the tripod set up. Sometimes it might be a 2 second, it might be a 10 seconds. However, there have been times where I've been, say, taking a shot with a 10-second delay and I've hit the timer and then suddenly realized there was a setting or something that I've not got in place right and the shot's just not going to work. But then I've then got to sit through the 10-second timer plus however many seconds the exposure might be. Could be 40 seconds and I'm sat waiting before I can alter the settings. Because I always thought once you've hit the shutter button, you've got to wait for the image to be taken. That's always how it was with the DSLRs that I used to have. Turns out, not actually the case with the Sony. So if you press the shutter button to start a countdown timer and then realize that you don't want the shot to be taken, you press the shutter button again, it will instantly cancel the timer and you're free to make whatever setting changes you want, and then you just press the button again to restart the timer. And then lastly, to round the video off on the topic of long exposures, most cameras will have a shutter speed range of a 1/4000th or a 1/8000th of a second, all the way up to around 30 seconds. And then most cameras have an option called bulb, which can go for as long as you've got the shutter button held down. This is usually where having a cable release comes into play because you don't want to be holding onto the shutter button because you're going to shake the camera. Now, on many cameras, bulb will be a separate option on the dial wheel, but on Sony cameras, it's actually hiding after the 30-second shutter marker. So if you slow your shutter speed all the way to 30 seconds and then go one step further, you'll then access bulb. However, the quirks of it is there are some criteria that need to be met in order to access bulb mode. Firstly, it cannot work in continuous shooting mode. It can only work in a single shot mode. And secondly, it only works in mechanical shutter, not in electronic. What's frustrating is the camera doesn't tell you that's why you can't go beyond 30 seconds. It's not like you get to 30 seconds and you keep winding the wheel and it pops up a message saying you can't access bulb because you're in one of these modes. It just sits there making you look like a fool until you remember you've got the wrong settings. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. Hopefully some of those tips were interesting or helpful. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to leave them in the comment box down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already done so, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video.